McTear.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Michael McTear. I am an Emeritus Professor, which means I've retired. But I'm still very active because I've been working in conversational systems for a long, long time. Right away back before they were spoken systems. I wrote a book in 1987 called The Articulate Computer. Now things have changed a lot since then. And what happened when I retired was that a lot of project possibilities were coming up to do work in socially relevant types of systems, like in mental health support. And my colleagues didn't really know very much about the conversational aspects of that. And so I was invited to join the teams, and that has kept me busy for quite a few years now, and I hope into the future.
That's amazing. And how do you feel about that you've been working in this field for so long that only now you see this huge flow and everybody is happy?
Well, it's naturally very exciting because when I first started, people just thought, well, that's science fiction, that'll never happen. We can't possibly do that. And they basically laughed at my ideas. I remember when we first tried to implement a system using a Unix box, and people were laughing at my colleague talking to the computer. They thought, what on earth is he trying to do? And now, of course, it's really gone on leaps and bounds, and it's not just a few people like myself doing it. It's the big companies basically have adopted it, and I don't know why quite, but it's really got to the stage now that so much is coming out, it's almost impossible to keep up, and I'm glad I'm not doing any other work because it would be very difficult to keep up with it.
You're specialized in conversational conversational interface. What is a conversational interface for you?
Well, it's a system that you can talk to fairly naturally, the way you would talk to each other, rather than having to go through the rather more unnatural type of interactions with a graphical user interface. So it in theory anyway, and then sometimes in practice, it enables you to have a natural conversation with some back-end system.
If you look at a lot of the chatbots and voice bots that are out there now, and you use your knowledge of a conversational interface, how do you feel about those chatbots? Do they live up to the standard?
Well, and I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. I think it very much depends what sort of system you actually want and what you're able to develop with your technology. And some of them are going to be more controlled by the system, and so the user can't really say very much except what has been predicted pretty much by the system that they can say. And then there are others that are totally open domain, the sorts that Google and Amazon and Facebook are developing. And those, of course, are really truly conversational, but they demand a huge amount of technology to make them actually work. And even so, they don't always work very well yet.
And which ones do you think have the most future?
I think Google's Lambda is very promising, and they're investing a lot of resource in that. But I think the Amazon, for example, they have the Amazon Prize, where they have university teams competing to develop a system that can hold a coherent conversation with users over a period of about 20 minutes. The one that manages that the best gets a rather big prize. And the interesting thing there is that those are tested initially. They're deployed with the ordinary population who, in the United States, I don't think in Europe yet. And so they're deployed actually for just ordinary people who will say anything basically to the system. So they really have to be very robust. And I think a lot has been learned really through that sort of enterprise.
And what kind of applications do you see happening with those tools?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot in things like conversational search. I think that's for the big enterprises and for Google in particular, of course, because that's where all their money comes from. and if they don't keep hold of search, that's going to be a disaster for them. So I think that's very important. People do like to do search. You Google things, but on the other hand, it would be handy sometimes to be able to converse about the results and not simply just have to go through a list of links and try and find out for yourself. So I think that's going to be a very important thing. But for some of us who are not in the big companies, I think there are other opportunities in the socially relevant domains, like what we have been working in, like mental health support, general health care, helping young people, for example, who are disadvantaged. And another one that I'm involved in is older people, providing companionship and support to help them live in their own homes in a healthy way. So I think there are a lot of opportunities both for the big companies and also for smaller companies as well, and very small groups like ourselves.
How do you use the conversational interface for the mental health support? How does that work?
We actually have two different projects, and the one that I'm talking about today is pretty much a system directed. So it is it's based on a psychological theory called PERMA, and it's around the idea of promoting positive thinking and positive experience and so on. And so it's much more of an instructional type of system. The user doesn't really have a lot of input into it. That's something that might get developed later. But the system asks you which particular topic you want to talk about. You choose the topic. It tells you a little bit about it and asks you if you would like to hear more or move on to something else. So it's very much controlled by the system. The reason partly for that was that we didn't have the resource to develop a very open-ended system where people could say anything they want. The other one we're doing is a little bit more open-ended, and we're doing things like analysing the emotion behind people's speech as well, and then developing interactions that will follow on from that. So if they sound sad or angry or whatever, it will lead to a different dialogue, so it's a bit more dynamic.
And do you have to involve rules and regulations about medical devices? Because the software is a medical device.
We certainly have to go through ethics regulations within the universities, but also within the companies where they have ethics committees, and you have to go through a lot, particularly in Europe anyway. But then even individually, anything we do with human subjects in the university goes through very stringent regulations to make sure that data is protected, that people's privacy is protected, and that we're not doing something that could be perceived as being harmful.
How do you take that hurdle?
You just have to work with it, really. And so, for example, we decided not to do diagnostics. There are some mental health systems, quite well-known ones, that actually do diagnosis, but sometimes they're not terribly reliable, and we certainly didn't want to go down that line. So that made it a little bit easier, but nevertheless, we're still doing something that we have to be very careful about. And when we keep records of what the people have said, we have to make sure that that's protected in some sort of a way.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you see the future of conversational interfacing?
I think they're really going to take off. I mean, the way things have happened in the past few months have brought them to the attention, really, of the general public. They were very much something that they were a little bit unknown for a lot of people. Although the uptake with things like Amazon Echoes, the devices and so on, Siri and all of these has actually opened the field up. But nevertheless, I think there's still a lot of development that's going to happen, and particularly now with these very technologically advanced systems using the large language models.
And what would your advice be to a startup that wants to start in the medical field or mental health care with large language models helping people with something? medical.
I think they've got to be careful with the large language models because a lot of people don't really understand how that technology works. People are familiar with retrieval search, where you basically find a document or documents and then have a ranking system and determine which is the best output that you're going to give. With the large language models, they are simply just word prediction, so they're not actually going to existing documents that hopefully are trusted and reliable documents. They're simply just generating the next best word based on various probabilities that have been learned by the system over a large amount of data. They do produce quite coherent output, but it's not necessarily always factually correct. So I have found that I've written several books that I haven't actually written. I'm just waiting now to get the Nobel Peace Prize and see what else the large language model will give me.
But at the same time, I've tested with a few doctors. We tested GPT-3, ChatGPT, sorry.
Yeah.
And we put in raw data of a patient, and it actually produced the correct potential diagnosis.
Yes, well, I think part of the secret is what they now call the prompt engineering. I think that's a very important part of it. You're seeding the system with information. And so if you do that with a prompt that isn't very good, you'll get a response. And then if you beef up your prompt, you'll actually get a much better response. So it's really the art of that. And of course, a lot of people won't really realize that that's going to be a very important part of it.
So how do you see the future of prompt engineering?
I think people are going to have to learn. So the example you were saying about medics, for example, they would have to maybe have examples, templates. This is what's getting recommended now quite a lot. That would enable them to create better prompts. There might be some way those can be automatically generated as well. And then they would seed the system with that, because basically that's what it is understanding, whatever's given to it in the prompt, and then it actually finds the best response on the way it does the word prediction based on that whole context. The original language models, of course, were very simple. They were just based on the previous word, but now, of course, they can take in the whole context, and that's where the prompt is, in fact, very important.
You're an educator, and as an educator, how would you change the educational system here or in Europe for people to learn how to prompt or use AI?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of controversy, of course, over plagiarism. I think it'll be, if people actually embrace the technology and try and get the best out of it, and there's probably no harm in students actually using some sort of initial output and then curating it. I do this myself, actually, and a lot of people have been doing that, where they take it as a beginning. You don't have just a blank piece of paper, and you get some ideas and put them together. So it's no different, really, from looking up things maybe on the web. It just does it much more quickly. So I think that aspect is actually going to be very useful in education, that people learn better quite often when they teach themselves rather than listening to somebody talking for a long period of time.
That makes a lot of sense. And what will it do with creativity? All this conversational AI, and the blank piece of paper that they don't have to fill themselves.
Yeah, well, the problem is that to some extent then who's doing the creation? I mean, people have been talking about that in publishing as well. I looked when ChatGPT took off if I could find something on Amazon, and then I started to look and I downloaded one book that was there. But I very quickly realized it hadn't really been written by a human being, because bits got repeated, and which wouldn't have happened with a human writer. And there seemed to be a whole range of books there that were all generated automatically. So it's going to be a big thing for the publishing industry, I think, as well, to try and come to terms with that.
That might have a lot of impact on the publishing industry, but for the schooling system, what do you see? We teach creativity, or we don't teach creativity. How would you use AI and conversational AI to push the creativeness of students?
Yeah, well, I think if you give them a task to fulfill, and then they can perhaps use AI initially to get some ideas, but then the instructor then should then be able to make some sort of judgment and as to what they then have done with that. I mean, as I say, people get their information from somewhere. It doesn't come just out of the blue. They quite often get it from other books and on the web and so on. And so if there's some way that the students could be required to indicate what their own contribution is and how they've actually used the content, I think that's probably the way it's going to have to go. There may be some automatic systems that might eventually be able to do that. I think people are working on that to try and detect what has been automatically generated and what is human generated, but I'm not quite sure how they do that.
How will universities survive in this this field of developing technology, because they are sometimes a bit archaic. How do they manage to go through this?
Well, I think things have changed a lot anyway, and partly through the pandemic. I mean, when I was teaching, I would stand in front of a class for 50 minutes or so, and I was a bit old-fashioned. Maybe I would just simply give a lecture, and they could obviously ask questions. The attention span has changed an awful lot since when I first started, and people like short snippets now, and then they like a quiz or some sort of activity and maybe a discussion and so on. So I think AI will be able to support that to quite an extent, and people may not necessarily have the teacher standing physically in front of them all the time. People have to travel a long way sometimes to the university to be physically present, and we found that increasingly people weren't doing that. If they had the PowerPoint slides, they thought that was enough and they didn't have to go and listen to some boring old person sort of talking to them as well. But that could be used positively, really, and we've had that during the pandemic when everything was online anyway, and there was much more diversity then in the nature of the input. And I think in the end, of course, it might mean a reduction in the number of people that are employed as teachers to actually deliver material. But where they could be employed more usefully would be in tutorials and discussions. There's enough material anyway from some of the big players on all sorts of topics, really. We don't need to replicate that ourselves as teachers, but where we have the advantage, we can then discuss the things because of our expertise, and that's where people would have the benefit.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and your insights are delightful, and I definitely don't think you're old and boring, because I think that you're bringing an interesting insight, old methods with new technology. And I think that's good for all of us to understand where we're coming from and your vision on where we're going to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.